Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wistar, and in this lesson we're going to talk about the Model View Controller design paradigm. Just in case you're wondering first why I'm wearing these awesome 1960s style headphones, there's a little bit of noise outside the room right now and I just don't want to bring that into the video here. So off we go. We're going to talk about what MVC is and why it might actually be a good idea for when you start designing larger programs. We'll talk about how to take those programs and break them into the three main parts of MVC, and then we'll talk about how to put them together. So what is Model View Controller? Well, as the name suggests, it takes a larger program and it tries to break the parts of those program into three main categories. The M stands for model, and model means the data in your program, the underlying information in order to make it work. The V stands for view, and the view are the classes which control the way that your program looks. And really the important part, the fundamental idea behind MVC is this idea of separating model from view. You want to take the classes that contain the data and separate them from the classes which contain the interface. The last part is controller, and those are the classes which contain the user interaction parts of your program. A lot of times you'll see that the view classes and the controller classes may be a little bit more closely related. That's okay. Why is it a good idea to use MVC? Well, one of the big reasons, because it seems like it should be way easier to just throw everything all together. That should seem like it's way less complicated, which is true, but when it comes time to make the next program, reusability is much easier when you're using Model View Controller. Say you have a great model class that you just want to use in a different kind of program. That would be much easier than having to go through the old program and remove all the display code that you don't really need anymore. You can just grab that model class, plug it into a new place. Similarly with the view, say you have a great looking interface, but you just want to use it with a different set of data. Again, separating model from view allows you to reuse your code. It also does make it easier from a programming standpoint for two reasons. One is just it's simpler. It will isolate the code for your model and your view into their own classes so that if your program doesn't seem to be working, you can really just ask yourself, okay, does it seem like it's not working correctly or does it just not look right? And that will tell you whether you should be looking in the model parts or the view parts. Similarly, from just a security standpoint or from a safety standpoint, the isolating of class variables into their own classes just makes it less likely that there's fewer ways for those variables to be modified, which makes it easier for you to control what's happening and also understand when maybe things aren't going quite right. Okay, how do we create the three parts of MVC? Well, as far as the model classes go, again, model means data. So we're going to take the important data variables in our program and stick them in our model classes. Once we've done that, we're normally going to, normally in your program you have what I call a master view class. That's the class where the main method is. That's the class that sort of runs your program. And normally that's where we will create objects of these model classes. One of the most important things as far as MVC goes that we'll talk about is this idea that you don't want to create those objects multiple times. You want there to be one copy of each object that you need in your program, and then you can pass references to that object to the different classes that might need them. So, for example, and we'll talk more about this later, but similarly, in your model classes, you may also want to create a reference to the master view class because that will allow your model classes, if they need to tell the application what to do. Now that things are separated, you need to have that reference variable to the master view class in order to be able to call those methods, and we'll see how that works. Now in the view class, similarly, view means display, so we're going to take all of our code which handles the display of the application and put them in the view classes. Those view classes, just like the model classes, will typically have objects of them created in the master view class. And just like with the model classes, typically we will have a reference variable to the master view in each one of our view classes so that they can also issue commands to the application if they need to. Now, an important point though here, typically speaking, we don't want to create our model objects inside of our view classes. We want to create them in the master view class. That way, since our view classes may not even be connected to each other, it's just a much easier way to control where those model objects live and to be able to pass them around from one object to or from one class to the next. The control classes are probably the easiest part of implementing this because they just use the same syntax that we've already seen. Typically, a controller class is created as a private inner class inside whatever view class that controller class needs to support. So if you're creating a screen class that needs to handle keyboard input, you would create the keyboard listener as an inner class inside that screen class. This is where we talk about sort of the linkage between view and controller. That's okay. So we create those private inner classes and then we register those controller classes as event handlers using the code syntax that we've already seen. Okay, so once we've created model view controller, how do we connect those things together? Again, we've talked about this, but the main idea to understand here is for each object in our program, for each instance of a model variable or a view class, we want to create that object once, oftentimes in the master view, but not always, but we want to create that object once, and then we want to pass a reference to that object to any other class that might need it. And the way that we're going to do that is using the constructor. So when we create a view class that needs a model object, we pass that model object in the constructor to the view class. If a class needs to access the master view, which is often the case, that's a little more complicated because the master view is the one that's creating those objects. So it doesn't have an object of itself, but it can pass a reference to itself. And the way that you do that is by using this variable, which we've talked about a little bit in the past, but just to review, when a method uses the this variable, it means that the method is referring to itself. So for the master view to pass itself to an object's constructor, it needs to put this in the parentheses. And we'll see an example of that. Okay, let's look at an actual example in code. So here's an application that does not use model view controller. This is the before picture. We're going to take this app and we're going to transform it into model view controller. So I've got an app. It does temperature conversion. It converts from Celsius to Fahrenheit. The user gets to choose the Celsius temperature and then it displays the Fahrenheit temperature. So this is all sort of standard user interface stuff that we've already seen before. We initialize this variable here. We have to convert it to Fahrenheit here. And then down here, we have a listener for our spinner, which has to call this helper method, which converts the temperature. So, I mean, we've got temperature stuff all over the place, and that's kind of messy. Let's see what it looks like before we look at the new and improved design. So if we go ahead and run this program, what we see over here, we've got our app, it's got a spinner. If I go up, the temperature updates itself. If I go down, the temperature updates itself. But like I said, this is messy. Let's try to do this using MVC. And if we were going to do that, the first thing we would need to do is make our model classes. The model class that we need in question here is temperature. So I've gone ahead and created a temperature class. It contains, here's where that temperature variable went. Now it lives in our temperature class. And also notice, here's my reference to the master view, which we're going to need inside our program. We get that in our constructor, and that's where we initialize it. So that's where we assign it to our class variable. Here are some accessor methods for temperature. Notice that my accessor method for Fahrenheit is where I put the converting code. That way we don't have to store the Fahrenheit temperature as a class variable. And then notice here, so when the user tells the temperature to update itself, what we do is we update the temperature, and then we call, using our master view variable, we call update panel, which has also changed somewhat. So let's take a look at this class here and see what's changed here. So instead of having a double, now we have a temperature object. We construct that temperature object here, and notice that we've passed this. So this is how the master view passes itself to a model class. Now we can use the model class's accessor method. So we can use getTempC, we can use getTempF to get that information. And the other thing that's changed now is our temperature listener. So now what we're doing is, once we've accessed the new value of our Celsius temperature, we're calling the mutator method in our model class. And then remember, that method calls update panel. So the model class is going to tell the master view class to update itself. And so that code is here. So now when we run this version of the program, we will see that it's exactly the same. From a functionality standpoint, Model View Controller, it's not going to make your programs look any fancier or more exciting, but what it will do is make it easier to organize the information. So just to quickly recap, we've talked about using Model View Controller to separate out the data, which is the model, from the display, which is the view. And that makes our programs more reusable, and it also makes them easier to debug and to just kind of figure out what's going on. We talked about how to set up those three parts of our program, and most importantly, how to connect them together by using object references for the different parts of your program that need to talk to each other, and then passing references to those in the constructor to set them up. All right, you're all set.